Nobody wants to talk about the losses, the casualties, and the fatalities of the Ukrainian army. Of course, we can propagate the idea that they are winning, but the reality is that the Russians don't aim at take territory. They aim first at destroying the enemy. That's the strict application of a Clausewitzian principle that has been a basic principle of the Russian art of war. And they're playing that exactly according to the doctrine. And that's what they are doing. So now when Emmanuel Macron tries to convince people using the square kilometers or the percent of territory, this is BS.
Situation between November 2022 and now, more than 1,000 days of war. Yeah. The Russian army took less than 1% of the Ukrainian territory. So I want everybody listening to us and watching your program to be aware of the fact that the Russians, they are not performing well there.
This is BS. That means that he didn't understand what the Russians are doing. The problem is that we see that the Ukrainians are missing people. They are moving troops around. They are even restructuring their forces just in time, so to say, because they changed the structure of the army. Even in the battle of Krasnoarmeysk, they had to change the structure of the army to have more a core-based structure because they cannot move ahead. So that means in order to keep command structures, they need to adjust the size of the forces to the troops they have and that means the complete restructuration of the command structure as the war goes on, which adds to the problems, by the way, because you know perfectly that when you start to modify the command structure during the fight, you create confusion, you create problems, and that's exactly what you have in the area of Krasnoarmeysk and so on. Krasnoarmeysk is Pokrovsk.
And so in light of all of that, in terms of the actual reality on the battlefield, and I would add, I didn't get a chance to validate it this morning, but there is a video that's floating around a lot of Telegram channels of a Ukrainian soldier that was released this morning that's just really frustrated. And he's talking about how low the potential is for these people that are stolen off the streets that you mentioned there. And he actually quantified what it's like to go through and how they're being treated by their own people, which and results in the motivation and the fighting capacity of what little is there, how low that is. In light of that, here's what you have of Zelensky, who is going, and this is, I think it was a video he released yesterday, in terms of trying to get together with Putin, trying to come to some sort of mutual agreement to end the war. He is going right after the heart of what Putin says they won't do, which in Zelensky's claim here, basically they're already in NATO.
Багато в чому все це базується на нашій взаємодії з партнерами, на нашій взаємодії з НАТО, яка вже досягнута. Українська армія загалом, наша інфраструктура оборони та безпеки дуже серйозно інтегровані в систему Альянсу. Багато є двосторонньої співпраці з членами Альянсу. І обов'язково всі практичні рівні нашої співпраці з НАТО ми будемо продовжувати.
So, I mean, what can you make of that when your army is being systematically dismantled and you don't even have the capacity to regenerate losses? In fact, they're less than losses. And there was another factor out released by the Ukraine side in terms of their legal system that there were, I think it was 125,000 have been accused of desertion since January of this year. And that rolls out to somewhere just south of 700 per day are abandoning the battlefield on top of the losses. Given all that, make sense of this to me. Why would Zelensky still go down a path that literally can't succeed?
Well, this is very strange. This kind of obsession. On the one hand, you may understand this obsession of not wanting to lose. I can understand that to some extent. But there is a point where you have to come back to the reality. and see that whatever you do just in fact increase or let's say worsens your situation. And then you have to make a choice. And in my view, the Ukrainian leadership is not mature for that, because we see that the more, and that's something I wrote in my book, Operation Z, in October 2022 already. I said the more this conflict will last, the less the chances for Ukraine to win are. Because obviously the Russians are obviously stronger, meaning that there is a point where you have to make a decision, and it's a dilemma. I understand that. But the problem is that Zelensky wants to stay in power. He refused to abandon power, and therefore he tends to persevere in this idea of fighting up to the last. I think it's a wrong strategy in my view, and it depends very much whether you want to have this idea that you fight up to the last moment like a hero, or whether you want to keep your country, you keep what can be saved from your country. And I think Zelensky has not understood the dilemma in which he is, or probably doesn't want to acknowledge that. And certainly the Europeans are not helping him in that, because there is a point where whatever you do will just worsen your situation. And that's exactly where we are. So again, here we are in a kind of in the area of psychology or psychiatry or things like that. I mean, there is no other explanation, because a rational explanation would say that I think Zelensky had let's say a rational feeling at the beginning of a special military operation when he started to negotiate with the Russians. He understood that things could only go wrong, and probably the best way is to have an agreement with the Russians. And note that if the agreement of March 2022 was entered into force, or would enter into force, you wouldn't have any Russians in Ukraine now. I mean, with the probable exception of Crimea, and there would be probably some discussions about the two Donbas republics. But for the rest, you would have the war would have stopped, and the Russians would have left the country. So that means that Zelensky probably had the intuition at the beginning that it was, and had a good intuition, in my view, that there is a point where if you can't fight, then the idea is to negotiate. But
and
the
now
problem is
that's even more complicated, because, and you mentioned this at the early part of the show today, the Russian side is wondering who can they legally even negotiate an end with, and Sergei Lavrov addressed that here just a day or so ago.
When and if, hopefully when, it comes to signing future agreements, the issue of the legitimacy of the person who signs these agreements from the Ukrainian side will be resolved.
You know, let me just ask, you and I are looking at this from a rational perspective. Our country is not being invaded, and we have the ability to just see with clear eyes the military balance and all the things that have happened in 3.5 years, plus the potential that's on the two sides going forward. And it's pretty clear that there's only one way this can end there. Russians are looking at it, I think, but with the same lenses there. So the question is, do you think that, or better question, to what extent do you think that the Russians, all the way back to the Alaska meeting with President Trump, are just saying, hey, we want to make, people think that, or believe that we're trying to have a negotiated settlement, we're willing to be reasonable, but they know that the other side isn't willing to be reasonable, meaning that they know from the beginning they're going to continue fighting until they accomplish their objectives here? Or do you think that they're actually hoping that something could break loose?
Well, probably a little bit of both. First of all, we have, as you rightly said, we understand the conflict as we do, and probably the Russians do in a very similar way. But an important point here is that Donald Trump probably also now starts to understand the conflict with this kind of lenses, as you put it. And probably within the Trump administration, people also try to understand that the conflict in that way. And that's an important point. Now, the problem is that Zelensky, for many reasons, probably the most important is that he wants to stay in power, but probably also because there are people in Ukraine who would not allow him to deal with the Russians, probably. And so that's certainly the Ukrainian domestic factor, if you want. I mean, Zelensky personal, but also Ukraine domestic factor. Even if you have more and more Ukrainians who now want a negotiation process. But the problem is that the Europeans, which by the nature of things should have a more rational approach to the conflict, do not.